okay to talk loudly, but if my mic turns on all of a sudden, it will be really loud. Okay. So I'm going to admit out of the gate that I do have a bit of a bias because we are a building service provider. So I'll speak from my own personal experience, and you can take, make your own decisions at the end of the conversation. But I thought I would actually first start with a little bit of a scenario and see if you can perhaps relate to it. So we'll talk a little bit about 3 directors at a condo board. So Michael, Shirley, and Heather, they face a dilemma. Barry, their live-in superintendent, he seemed like a great choice when they hired him about 9 months ago. But now with their upscale building looking less than stellar, they aren't sure what to do. So even though he covers the basic cleaning most of the time, there's coffee cups and some litter collecting in the parking garage. There's some burned out bulbs in the stairwells, and there's scum lines in their pool. But despite many frequent assurances from Barry, he never seems to get around to it. So Barry also often needs he works hard. Barry says he works hard. So he needs some vacation. He often needs time off for various reasons. Usually with short notice. It's kind of stressful to find someone to cover for him. So the board realizes that they should probably let Barry go and look for a new super, but no one relishes that idea because Barry is their 3rd live-in in 2 years. So Michaels mentions that, some owners, they really like Barry, even though he isn't really doing his job. So how do they find a suitable candidate? Where do they even start? Well, Shirley laments that it took them so long to interview and find a replacement last time, and Heather agrees, this is not going to be fun. So what choices do they have? Well, traditionally, high-rise condos have been set up with a live-in superintendent, and maybe that's what some of you have now. In many cases, they work wonderfully, or they have worked wonderfully in the past. Because residents want to have an ambassador for their building, someone to maintain the common areas, respond to unexpected problems and emergencies. But we are seeing a recent trend in condos weighing the benefits and costs of having instead a reliable building service provider. And many new condos in the region, even luxury, ultra luxurious buildings, are now constructed without the provision of a super suite. So the idea today was to talk about why we're seeing a shift in these trends. So there's a few different factors, and I'm going to touch on a couple. Michelle has definitely addressed several, and then Marni's definitely going to talk about some of the liability aspects of it. So one of the first things that we notice as a conversation that's happening with our boards when we meet with them is that it's real estate, it's valuable real estate. So as was mentioned, rather than designating prime condo space as a super suite, the developers that we work with today are not building it. They're not going to allow that $500,000 to $1 million unit become, just set aside for a superintendent. It's just too valuable for them. The other shift we see are in existing boards. So this is a big part of the conversations that we have at LCM is that existing boards are realizing that they have a bit of a golden egg. So especially boards that have been built for a while and they have a spacious unit there, they realize that there is valuable capital that the corporation can gain either from selling the unit, there's a process for that, or renting it out even at current market rents. So I don't know if anyone's looked at what it costs to rent a place lately, but it's expensive. And it's great if you're the person doing the renting or leasing. The reverse is true, though, about those that are living in. So Michelle talked about how it's very attractive to potential live-ins to have that free suite. Everyone loves the idea of, well, I just have to work and I can live there for free. The challenge is that the CRA is less excited about the living for free idea. So they actually consider it a taxable benefit. And we've really found that this is a conversation that most live-in superintendents are not aware of, at least at first glance. That they're going to see taxation based on the current market rate that unit would normally fetch. So those rents are actually quite high in a lot of our buildings. And so it means that superintendent actually is paying for the value of that suite, and it could be $3,500 a month maybe they've assigned a value on. Probably much higher than they would normally, perhaps be renting themselves. So that actually can result in less net income for the live-in superintendent. And when they see that on their first paycheck or at the end of their tax year, it can actually be a negative. And so it's less desirable than it used to be to have that live-in arrangement. So that's a little bit about the real estate, but a big part of what we talk about is accountability. And so we reference that in our little scenario. And Michelle talked about it too. So when your neighbor is also your cleaner, it's very difficult to address and fix their performance issues. So, we've all experienced perhaps, we've had a neighbor that has done something that we don't like. Maybe they've put their shoes out in the common area hallway, and even something like that, neighbor to neighbor, that's hard to have that conversation, right? But now what if it's your task to have that conversation daily or regularly? What if they never fix it? What if it doesn't get better? Loyalties also form, and I think all of us see this in condo communities. It's very difficult to navigate. So often superintendents are friendly. They make close ties to particular individuals in the buildings, and that's natural because they're living there too. That's their neighborhood and community. But as you can imagine, it's tricky to discipline that person, perhaps to have a change in their role when they continue to reside there, and when there's alliances that form. And sometimes those can become combative if there's a divisive nature in the condo community regarding, how well, we'll say, Barry is doing. Mrs. Smith loves him. Mr. Henderson is ready to take him to court over something because this is just, they do not get along. So those loyalties can be very difficult to navigate. The biggest reason, though, that most people will approach a building service provider is around complacency and the feeling of needing some accountability. So a lot of times superintendents feel that they are on call 24/7, and they may in fact be. And so because they feel like they're always working, sometimes they end up not working, if that makes sense. So the difference between themselves and a building service provider is the building service provider has built-in accountability, and they have to be accountable to the terms of their contract and their scope of work. And their employee, rather than being even a subcontracted individual, is usually an hourly employee with set hours that is just, they have to be moving and grooving through the building for the entire time, which is very different from someone who's in their unit and maybe watching TV, but is on call if something happens, but isn't necessarily vacuuming or cleaning stairwells. So perhaps you can, this may not apply to everyone's situation, but perhaps there's bits and pieces that you may find you can relate to. And we have those types of conversations frequently. So a building service provider has to be bound by the terms of their service contract and be accountable. So really it's unfair and unrealistic to expect an individual live-in to be available 24/7. So gone are the days where we have a slave that can be there, except for when they run out to get groceries. Nobody wants that anymore. Nobody would want to be that type of employer, obviously. So a reputable building services provider will bring a team approach. And that still provides you that 24/7 coverage, because that still needs to happen. But how it's structured instead is a dedicated daytime person. So that is your building manager for the day. Typically it's like a 7 to 3, an 8 to 4. That same person becomes the ambassador for the building. Everyone knows them. They know you. They know your pets. They know who should be coming and going up the building. But then also that team approach kicks in as soon as that person leaves for the day. So if there's water coming out of your ceiling fan, or the alarm is going off, or the parking garage door won't close, those types of things can still be dealt with very quickly by a mobile team that's equipped and within a quick response time, knows how to fix a pinhole leak, knows how to deal with the trades or the alarm companies, knows the mechanical and building systems, and in turn provides the building manager time to go home, to refresh, be ready for the next day, and provides a really stable, scalable, fair work environment for everybody, while still providing a really high service level for the buildings. And those people need to be trained. That's part of the accountability piece. So Michelle talked a lot about that. And building services providers do a lot of training, most of which the boards will probably never see. Most people think for the superintendent that their job is to clean, maybe to fix things. And it's true. Usually we provide a scale of about 70% janitorial to 30% administration. Some buildings it's 60-40. Excuse me, but buildings today have become very complex. So you have entry fob systems, you have surveillance systems, you've got portals that have to be used, you have very complex amenities in some cases, you might have pools and spas, there need to be certifications for that type of things, they're handling chemicals, so you need WMIS training. We mentioned at heights training, if there's going to be using anything like a ladder of a certain height. And then there's also the accountability for quality. So how do you measure it? How do you know if they're doing a good job? So a quality building service provider would provide random checks using a quantitative software that can provide analytics to them to know if that person is in fact doing what the scope of work is expected of them. And then the other part that comes in obviously is around payment. So they have to be an employer, they're already doing all of the risks and obligations that come with that. So part of it is competitive pay and benefits now. So gone are the days where you can have a 2-for-1 mom and pop. Unfortunately, that doesn't provide fair reimbursement for an employee. So you can no longer have Mr. and Mrs. Smith working for you, but only Mrs. Smith is getting paid. One individual, one paycheck, set hours, set breaks, set lunch times in a day. Those are all things under administrative labor that need to happen and to be covered. And so there's accountability not just on the employee side for like, are they doing the job that they should be doing, but also the accountability on the employer side, which I think has been well covered. So we've talked about this as a dying breed, that's true. So not only have the expectations changed for what you can get for the money, there's expectation changes as far as the communities. So we're all very connected. People can send an email and they'll know if their text has been read. Like, people want responses quickly. And superintendents can get inundated by that. So there's an expectation of instant response. Typically, an employee today will basically not put up with some of the expectations that would have been expected of them even 5 years ago. Like, they're just like, I'm not doing it for that money. So what do boards do? How do they handle that? So this is why you have to have a team approach. This is why there has to be some provisions in place to allow them not to burn out, so that you can keep the right candidate in the role for a long time. So those are things like, having emails, but that maybe a team are receiving them so that they can, have some support if they need help with that. Having set working hours, knowing that there's still going to be the team that jumps in to support them and get the job done outside of their working hours. So those work ethics, from an employer standard, have to change, but also we're seeing, unfortunately, a change in the work ethics for potential employees. And it's difficult to find the right candidate. So I don't know if you've tried to attract or interview or hire for a living recently, but it is not an easy task to find the right person. So many people just think free rent, this is great. It may be, though, that they're not necessarily the most qualified for the job. The other thing, and Michelle mentioned it, is that our experience is that sometimes they're looking for that living situation because perhaps their current living situation is in flux. And it could be that it's a short-term solution for them. And there is a great deal of training that goes into onboarding someone into your building. And it's a position of trust. So nobody wants to cycle through 3 people in 2 years or something like that, but it's happening more and more. It used to be you had the same super for 20 years and it was great. And we would love that. But it's unfortunately not happening. We're just not seeing it happening. And part of the problem too is that right now it's an employee's marketplace. So there's more people looking for workers and there's workers looking for work. So it's difficult to attract a superintendent because you're looking for someone that has strong customer service skills. They have to be good communicators. But you're also expecting them to do manual labor. But also it would be nice if you knew how to run a pool and safely use chemicals, but also you knew what to do in a crisis. And also it would be nice if you knew how to speak to people without offending them, and also how to deal with vagrants and the police if they show up. But also we need you to make sure that you can do technology and use the portal. And could you also make sure that the fobs are running? And also we need you to know where your boundaries are. So you can do work here, but not in the unit. Can you see the challenges? So our job as building services provider is to do that vetting. And there's a lot of interviewing. There's a lot of reference checking that has to happen. These people are master key holders. They need to be police checked. They need to be bondable. They need to be insured. And there's still no guarantees. You may hire a building service provider and have a staff member and it's not the right fit. Perhaps their personality is not the right fit for the demographic. But there is a higher chance of success, we will say, when you work with someone whose entire business model is to provide that staffing specific to condos. We can flip there. So maintaining the staffing, so you've hired a person, you've got a building services provider now, there's someone in place. What does both the board and the building service provider need to do to maintain that person? Because Nobody likes churn. Nobody likes change. Change is stressful. So you have to make sure that they're getting a comprehensive pay package, and people expect benefits. Excuse me. So your building service provider needs to be providing that, and that's what's going to be reflected in their package price to you. So if you think, well, they're providing someone and this price is pretty good, you should be concerned about that, because what are they paying their person? The cost of living is very high, and people are not willing to do this job for minimum wage, unfortunately. So it is a skill set that's required that goes well beyond the ability to swing a mop or to vacuum a floor. And that will help you keep stable staffing. And so even though it's very tempting to go to the lowest price, unfortunately that is often where you will see the turnover, and you won't know that until you're already in it and it's too late. So we do know that, especially since COVID, staff turnover is sometimes unavoidable. Even though everyone knows that you can ask and require a live-in superintendent to leave with a relatively short amount of notice, much less than normal, it actually can be quite difficult to get them to leave. So how do you handle that? So now you've got Barry, who some people love and do not think he should be leaving at all, and he's now in there, squatting. I'm not leaving. That is a tricky situation. I think Michelle has had her share of those. Probably 30, 40 years ago, they'd just take off the front door and just wait for that to, but that doesn't happen. That's not allowed.
You can't put the things on the front lawn anymore.
We have to handle things in a way that is appropriate and proper, and what that is usually a process. So the challenge is easily avoided with a building service provider, because if someone is not working out, they'll be replaced that day. And they will always have people cross-trained so that they can helicopter someone in. The other thing too is that in most cases, with an exiting superintendent, it isn't actually a combative situation at all. It actually is more often a really nice situation where you have someone that perhaps has served the building faithfully for decades and is much loved. And in those situations, it's wonderful, because a building services provider can come in and train with that person and learn the tribal knowledge that they know, all the little quirky things in the back room, learn about the systems, meet all of the trusted trades. And that transition can go, and most often that is the way it goes, very, very smoothly. And that is a very important way in order to maintain continuity with your staffing. So the goal is to plan ahead. If you have a superintendent that you feel is perhaps going to have a change in the next 3 or 5 years, have the conversations now with the board or with the building services provider. It's so much easier to make the decision when you're not in a stressful situation or a crisis. But there are times when people get sick, illness happens, deaths in the family, perhaps the family situation changes and they need to move. In those situations, a reputable building service provider will be able to, for lack of a better term, helicopter in and help you out. And we're called upon to do that frequently. The reason they can do that is because building systems are basically similar in buildings. So that familiarity will get you going. The core things will be taken care of that day. And there's usually the same trusted trades that are already being worked with and so forth. So that can help cover unexpected staff turnover or absences. And then typically too, you'll see that there will be not just one individual that will be trained, but there should be a regional manager, perhaps perhaps a floater, 2 or 3 people as a minimum that get to know your building. So that tribal knowledge is not just held with one person. We were talking about it at our table over lunch, where you don't want to have the, hit by a truck situation, where everything that needs to be known resides with one person and something happens with them, then what? This helps to alleviate that concern. And, we're already employers. We already have all of the risks and obligations that come with one. So rather than just having the one person, typically there would be a team of people that are employed that can get to know the building so that it can continue to be cared for the long term and for months and years to go. So our building service providers, they already deal with staff, and that's so you as a board or you as the property manager don't have to.
Thanks, Christina. I have 2 questions,
Okay.
if that's okay.
I have 2 answers.
The first is about Barry.
Oh, Barry.
Yeah.
Barry's a good guy.
Yeah. Let's assume the condo that Barry works for is a high-rise with a superintendent suite. Barry's been there for 20 years. Condo has a pool. It's got a bunch of stuff that he has to climb up on a ladder to get to.
Yep.
But because he's been there for 20 years, he doesn't have any real on-the-job training, or any real official training. He just has sort of on-the-job training over 20 years, and he's been able to change out the pool water. He's been able to fix the sauna.
Yeah.
But Barry's retiring on good terms,
Yep.
and he's leaving the superintendent suite, no problem. And the board says, you know what, let's not hire another superintendent. Let's take advantage of your golden egg analogy and sell the superintendent suite and go with the building services provider. Now, Barry had, through 20 years of attrition, had all of the skills to do the pool, the sauna, the climbing the ladder. When a condo hires a building services provider, is that team approach applied to doing all of those jobs, or does a building service provider provide one individual who's sort of trained on all of those things, or is it, here's our team, and one person from our team will work on the pool, and one person will work on the sauna,
That's a good question.
and then Jim will climb the 20-foot ladder? I mentioned ladders because 2 years ago I actually climbed up a ladder to trim some trees, fell and broke 2 vertebrae in my back.
That's right.
So
Don't do it.
Don't climb ladders if you're not ladder trained.
So how we handle that, and I'll just speak from our company perspective. So how we handle that is typically you will still have one person that's your main point of contact. So, the person will be trained on the basic core skills for the job, which in most cases are your janitorial and the required administrative, those type of technical skills. And in most cases will also be trained for the pool. So with pools and spas, they have to work under the supervision of a CPO certified pool professional. So that's for Class B commercial pools, which in our organization we have 5. And so they are the ones that will meet with the pool inspectors and oversee the pool chemical changes. But your building manager can be trained by them and work under their direction. So they're the ones that can still do all your daily pool checks and do the pool care, but have this experienced professional as an asset as part of their team. So it doesn't mean that all of a sudden you have to have a bunch of different people in the building. The one exception to that is typically at heights. So in our case, our building, our managers don't use anything over, that can't be reached within, I think it's 10-foot ladder, maybe it's a 6-foot ladder. My safety person would know better. But there's limits to the ladder usage, and so then typically you'd have someone with at-heights training. If it's something that needs to be done frequently in the building, then we will train that person. We'll send them for the 2-day course and have them do their working at heights. So it's not that you have to exchange one person for a giant team. It's just that you have the benefit of that team approach and that knowledge as a support for that person.
Okay, thanks. I will leave my second question till the end because
Okay.
it's a two-part question.
Oh, I will think if I have answers.
And now we will go to the lawyer on the panel here, Marni.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, I mean, if anybody thought that they might want to go to law school, see if it's fun. First of all, it's not. But second of all, today is your lucky day because we're going to do Employment Law 101. And at the end, we're going to run through a hypothetical case study, which is exactly how law school exams are structured. So if you do really well, then maybe you should write the LSAT. I think the next sitting of the exam is coming up in a month or two. So, what I'm going to be talking to you about today is first just the basics of employment law and the framework that applies to condominiums and that employment relationship when you have a superintendent. Two, we're going to review employees versus independent contractors. And finally, some good news, what you can do to proactively manage risk. So, as my co-panelists have already explained today, when you hire a superintendent, the condominium becomes an employer. And there really aren't many exceptions to that. All the rules and regulations that apply to employers across Ontario apply to the condominium as well. And those laws can be hard to understand and difficult to find. Two main sources of law are, of course, our statutes. So we have many of them that will be engaged in that employer-employee relationship. We have the Employment Standards Act, the Human Rights Code, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and many, many more. We also have common law obligations that apply to that relationship, and those come from judges in case law decisions. We call it common law, and those are changing and evolving and being published all the time. And again, they are difficult to understand and sometimes hard to find. And in law, there are many, many rules, and then, as you've probably heard, there are exceptions to the rules, and then there are exceptions to the exceptions, and so forth. So for live-in superintendents specifically, there are many statutory exemptions right in the ESA for that specific type of employee that apply to things like overtime pay, hours of work, and many other things. So there's just when you think you have it all figured out, there's probably another statute or another case that's just been released that will shake things up a little bit. Something that I've seen in every area of business and also in the condominium context is sometimes there will be somebody who is knowledgeable of these obligations that apply to condominium employers and will say, hey, you know what might be a good idea? What if we just hire this person as a contractor? Then we're not an employer, they're not an employee. Sounds like a good idea. In theory it is. However, the problem is that the employer-employee relationship is one that is determined by substance of the relationship and not just the label. So you might have a superintendent who's happy to be a contractor and the board is happy with that arrangement as well. You don't have to worry about payroll, etc. But there is a lot of risk when it comes to misclassifying a worker. So there can be penalties from the Ministry of Labor, there can be orders for back pay for taxes, CPP, if at the end of the relationship you let that person go, that's usually when we see somebody coming back asking for notice that would be awarded to an employee in that case. So you really need to be careful if you're thinking about engaging somebody as a contractor because it's not necessarily that simple. Some of the factors that are examined when looking at whether a worker is an employee or a contractor are things like control, ownership of tools, opportunity for profit or loss, exclusivity, integration, and the intention of the parties. But none of these factors are determinative. It really is a balancing, and most relationships will have features of both, But overall, I have the little duck here up on the screen because it's really that simple. If it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a duck, or in this case, it's an employee. So you might think that you're being clever getting around it, and in some cases, in certain business ventures, contractors are an excellent tool, but it is something to approach with caution.
Sorry.
Okay.
I warned people at the beginning.
So how to manage risk as an employer. One option that we've already covered extensively today is considered contracting the work out, and that's to a building services provider, not to an independent contractor necessarily. Independent contractors still can work, but you really have to think about that person running their own business and doing their own thing, and they might be providing that service to multiple condominiums, and so it is possible, but you need to be careful. Second, if you're going to have an employee, a superintendent, whether they're live-in or not, documentation is very important, specifically the employment contract. We have case law coming out probably every other year about what should and cannot be included in those employment contracts. So one that maybe you used 5 years ago that someone on your board had used in their business might not cut it. And they're really powerful tools that can limit your liability significantly, especially at the time of termination if they're done properly. So it's something that, although there might be some cost up front to engage your legal counsel to prepare that employment contract, it can really pay dividends in the future. And third, I think the most important takeaway here is that you need to find a trusted advisor, whether that's an HR consultant, an employment lawyer, somebody who you can run questions by, who can look at your employment contract, who can avoid terrible situations that come across my desk all too often, and that can help you manage those situations, those difficult situations before they get ugly. Okay, so now that you know everything that there is to know about employment law, I'm going to run you through a hypothetical case study. We can imagine that this is Barry again. I'm going to read it to you because it's pretty small, but what I want you to do is, as I'm reading it through, make little notes to yourself, little issues or liabilities you think you might spot. And we'll see who should write the LSAT next. Okay, so we have Condominium Corporation ABC hires a live-in superintendent. For 10 years, the employee has done a great job in their role. However, recently, the board of directors of the condo has noted that the employee is slow to complete routine tasks, and some important items are not being addressed as they should. The board is aware that the employee has some back issues, but the employee has never raised this in a formal capacity, nor have they requested workplace accommodations or modified duties. The employee has also been involved in some verbal altercations with one of the unit owners who has approached the employee on a number of occasions to criticize the employee's work and provide direction. The employee has advised the board that they do not want the unit owner coming near or speaking to them anymore, but does not want the board to investigate the unit owner's conduct further. The employee is 63 years old. The board is considering retaining a building services provider so that they do not have to manage the day-to-day work of the employee. They have not been satisfied with the employee's performance recently and would rather end the relationship on good terms before anything gets complicated. So, the board reviews the employee's employment contract, which they prudently sought at the time of hiring, and notes that the termination clause states as follows. The employer may terminate the employee's employment at any time by providing the employee with only 4 weeks of notice or pay in lieu of notice of dismissal. In no case shall the employee be provided with less than what they are entitled to pursuant to the Employment Standards Act. Sounds good. The employer may terminate the employee's employment at any time for cause and without notice or pay in lieu of notice for any material breach of this agreement. Looks pretty good. Given the language in the employee's employment agreement, the board issues a termination letter to the employee dismissing their employment without cause, effective immediately, and provides the employee with 4 weeks of pay in lieu of notice. The employee is disappointed to receive the termination notice, but seems to take the news well. The board acknowledges in the termination letter that the employee is also entitled to at least 1 week of notice to vacate the superintendent's suite, per the Residential Tenancies Act. Another one that I didn't mention earlier. However, the board advises that if the employee would like to stay longer, they may do so for a limited time, provided they pay rent. The employee starts paying rent immediately, as informed a few days later that they must vacate the unit within 30 days. Ultimately, the employee does not vacate the unit, and the board receives a demand letter from the employee's lawyer. Don't go to the next slide. I don't want to give away the answer key. What sort of liability does the condominium have in this situation? Anybody spot any potential issues? What do you think that demand letter might say? Anybody?
The termination, the back pay can't just be 4 weeks. It's been there, like you said, 20 years?
10 years.
Oh, 10 years? Yeah.
Mhm.
So if they have to, take into consideration during the 10 years that they've been working there.
Yeah, termination pay, that's a big one. And that's going to be probably the main focus of that demand letter in 2 ways. So although the employment contract said only 4 weeks of notice is owed, under the Employment Standards Act, that employee is owed 8 weeks of notice. So as a result, the condominium at a bare minimum needs to provide 4 more weeks of pay in lieu of notice. However, unfortunately, by not paying the minimum amount required by the ESA, the condominium is also now open to liability for a potential claim of punitive damages for that mistake. What that means is that when an employer fails to meet basic legislative requirements, in certain cases, judges have found that that is conduct that is worthy of an additional award against the employer for breaching their obligations under that statute. Those awards are rare and are fairly modest. It's not comparable to what we see in the United States, but nevertheless, that is a risk now of liability that the condominium has because they didn't even meet the minimum legislative requirements in providing notice. Another, and I think what you were referencing is that, length of service, things like that need to be taken into account. In some cases, that's true. So there's a common misconception that the Employment Standards Act, which has a formula of about a week per year of service, but capped at 8 weeks, is what dictates termination pay. That's not correct. I like to explain it as that's the floor, but it's not the ceiling. There is additional liability that employers can have at the time of termination under the common law, which we talked about earlier, for something called common law reasonable notice. And that is actually the default framework that applies at the time of termination unless you contract out of common law obligations in the contract. So we reviewed the termination clause in this contract, and it sounds pretty good. It sounds like the condominium was opting into the ESA and not the common law, but there were some drafting deficiencies in that clause that made it totally unenforceable. You wouldn't know it just by reading it, but we have very specific and stringent case law on what needs to be included and what can't be said in those clauses for them to be enforceable. So with a properly drafted termination clause, 8 weeks really would be the condominium's only liability for termination pay. But since it's not quite right, then we're looking at additional liability for common law notice, which isn't formulaic like the ESA. It weighs relevant factors like age. This employee is 63 years old. Length of service, 10 years. Character of employment, and availability of comparable employment. So there's a rough rule of thumb that gets used sometimes, and there's definitely exceptions to it, is that common law notice can actually look more like a month per year of service, which is significantly greater than the ESA. So you're looking at maybe 10 months, 8 to 12 months for this employee, and that's just for a without cause dismissal. Whereas if you had a good and properly drafted employment contract, it's 8 weeks. So I think that illustrates my point at how important those contracts really are.
Marni, please hit again the age of the employee, because they're 63. You have to make sure that if they cannot reasonably find another job with comparable wage, and at that age, their ability and their hireability, desirability is not exactly top shelf, you're going to be on the hook for that as well. It's a spicy meatball. Wow.
Worst case scenario, common law notice can run up to 2 years. So it could be a lot. And with somebody who's 63, if with true diligent efforts they aren't able to find new work in 2 years, I think it's still a little rich for this employee, but they potentially could have a claim for up to 2 years. So it's a lot. Did anybody else spot any potential?
Yeah, when they started renting out the unit, they became a landlord, and underneath the Residential Tenancies Act, you have to give proper notice. Mm-hmm. You can't just kick somebody out.
Correct. So the answer was there's potentially some violations under the Residential Tenancies Act here and how the board handled the dismissal. And that's correct. So there is a special carve-outs for live-in superintendents in the Residential Tenancies Act, which makes it a little bit easier at the time of termination, so that's good. But where the board went wrong here is, one, you cannot charge rent for the week after the dismissal. The superintendent is entitled to 1 week of notice to vacate the unit. Practically speaking, that's not very much time. And I find most boards, from a compassionate basis, want to give the employee more time to leave, and that's fine. But in this case, charging them for that 1 week is incorrect, and the employee could definitely claim back that rent. The other way where they made a mistake is by charging rent. And I think that by charging rent beyond that 1 week period, there's an argument to be made that they've now created a new landlord-tenant relationship. And when that happens, I think we've all heard the horror stories, it can be near impossible to get those tenants out. You just don't have many tools in your toolbox to force an eviction. You do have that opportunity at the end of the superintendent employment relationship, but if you don't handle it properly, you can definitely risk creating a new, fresh tenancy where all the rules under the Residential Tenancies Act apply. So they're going to have a hard time getting Barry to leave now. They might not be able to be honest. Did anybody else spot anything they thought was concerning or potentially problematic?
You mentioned he had a sore back.
Yeah,
Yes, I
that's
did.
right.
Yeah.
Health
So,
issue.
yes, health issues. So to recap, Barry has a sore back. The board knows about this, but there hasn't been any formal complaints. He hasn't requested workplace accommodations, but remember, one of the big reasons that they've decided that they want to terminate this employee is because they've slowed down, they're not really performing tasks properly. So here, when I'm looking at the situation, the Human Rights Code is really popping up in my mind on what sort of obligations the condominium has in that circumstance. So as an employer, the condominium has a duty to accommodate employees reasonably in the workplace. Also, a protected ground, so medical condition would be one of them, cannot be a factor in the decision to terminate. That's a very low bar. It is not the sole reason, not even the main reason, just a factor. And if there's a nexus between that protected ground and the reason for dismissal, you can be liable, that termination can be discriminatory. So here, you're probably sitting there thinking, but Barry didn't even raise this, how could we be responsible? The human rights case law has established that employers have a positive duty to inquire with employees when they know or ought to know that the employee requires accommodations to do their job. So So here, the employer, the condominium may have liability for failing to inquire, failing to accommodate, and discriminatory dismissal.
Does that apply even if they terminated without cause?
It does. So in Ontario, you can dismiss an employee anytime, any reason, as long as you're giving proper pay in lieu of notice or notice. 2 exceptions. 1, the dismissal cannot be discriminatory. And 2, it cannot be a form of reprisal. What I mean by that is it can't be retaliatory in response to the employee trying to assert a right that they legitimately have. So for example, I'm not doing that, that's unsafe work, I think I need ladder training, and they say, you know what, we're just done with you, just leave we're firing you, it's without cause, we'll give you notice, but we've had enough. So if that's retaliatory for that employee trying to enforce the rights under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, then that's reprisal. And reprisal is very expensive because even if that employee has only been with you for 2 months, the default remedy is back pay until it can get to a hearing at the OLRB, which you can imagine can take a long time. There's a default right to reinstatement. So just when you think maybe you have this person out of your hair, the relationship is really soured, they can get a order from the OLRB saying that they have to come back to work. And then you probably have to fire somebody that you just hired to replace them. So reprisal is bad.
So what about the harassment, the verbal harassment that was mentioned there?
Yeah, Christine mentioned the harassment. So I had mentioned in the hypothetical that there was an issue with one of the unit owners coming and criticizing the employee and giving them direction. They said that they didn't want the unit owner coming near them anymore or talking to them, but they said they didn't want the condo to do anything about it. So you might be thinking, okay, well, they said they didn't want us to do anything about it. They don't want us to investigate it. We'll just keep the peace. Great. Wrong. Under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, employers have a duty to provide a safe and healthy work environment. If an employee is experiencing harassment in the workplace, whether they use the H word or not, the employer has a non-discretionary obligation to investigate those harassment complaints. So just because the employee says, no, I don't want you to investigate it, knows that workplace harassment might be taking place, just might, there is a duty to investigate it. If they don't, that's a breach of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and the Ministry of Labor can come in and audit the workplace accordingly if the employee reports it. But similarly, we just talked about reprisal. If an employee is telling you, I think I'm being harassed, even if they don't call it harassment, and then shortly after you dismiss that employee, just the timing of those 2 events can give rise to a potential reprisal complaint because it is presumed that that event was a factor in the decision to terminate the employee. It's a rebuttable presumption, but that onus will be on the employer to prove that those difficulties with the unit owner had nothing to do with the decision to terminate. And that can be hard to do. And if you're not successful, that remedy of back pay can be a lot. Let's see if there's anything else we didn't hit.
Do you want me to go to the next slide?
Yes. Oh, finally, probably everyone's favorite, legal fees. So you get this demand letter, it sounds pretty intense. They're probably asking for almost $100,000 between the punitives, the common law, the reprisal, the human rights violation, and everybody's panicked. But don't worry, you have a lawyer who's going to read it and tell you it's going to be okay. But that lawyer is going to have to meet with the board and your property management team most likely to get all the relevant information and figure out what truly happened. In my experience in the condominium context, this takes more time than in other business contexts because there is usually not great record keeping that's happened. There's been different board members come and go, perhaps a change in property management team. Sometimes it's hard to even find out when this person started working. So those fees to even engage your counsel to be able to respond to that demand letter can be expensive. And then hopefully you're able to resolve it amicably with a reasonable settlement, but if not, and you find yourself at the tribunal at a hearing in court, those legal fees of course continue to build. Even if you think, you handle the situation mostly right, maybe a few hiccups, it can still be expensive. Similarly, if you do end up having to go to court, if you are not successful in the position that you take at court, you may have to pay a portion of the employee's legal fees as well. At the demand letter stage, there is usually a demand for some contribution to the employee's legal fees, and I would say many employment settlements do involve some contribution from the employer just to get the deal done. So that would be something else that you need to consider on both sides. I think we covered all of them. So not a great situation. This hypothetical that I wrote for you is a variation on a situation that myself and Chris have seen dozens of times. So this isn't a one-off. This isn't a rare occurrence. It's a very real situation that can happen. So two big takeaways for you in proactively managing risk. One, get your employment contracts dusted off, reviewed, have them prepared by a lawyer, ideally, so that you're not vulnerable to that common law notice. And two, before you decide to terminate somebody, you really need to get a legal opinion. There was issues with the back issue seemed fairly innocuous, and the disagreement with the unit owner, but it's, until you guys write that LSAT and go to law school, it's hard to know how deep those potential issues can run.